We also have a very special guest with us today, a name that needs no introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please put your hands together for one of the finest directors of our country, Mr. Gautam Ghosh. I would request Mr. Gautam Ghosh to come up on stage and inaugurate the event. Please. And also our Vice Chancellor, Sir, and Mr. Frisco Macker, and Mr. Joyanta Sengupta. Mr. Ghosh, we would request you to please say a few words.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's indeed a pleasure for me to attend the inaugural show of this wonderful exhibition. And what an idea! The display is so brilliant and excellent photographs. So I'm really, really thankful to Jadavpur University and other co-sponsors for inviting me. We live in an age of image making. You see snapshots everywhere. I think 2/3 of our population has a camera in their mobile. So image and images, full of images. But they are not really photographic images. They're just for recording, for sending it to the social medium. But photography is an art, of course. For that, it has to be learned, it has to be practiced, and that's a very, very long process. My generation has seen a total evolution of this photographic process, the techniques, from analog to digital. Even in analog, there were many techniques were evolved, and from there to digital. Still many photographers prefer analog. They are still using celluloid, but mostly gone. Even in films, we are using digital. Celluloid has gone. But I think, the photochemical process in an analog photographic age has been replaced by Photoshop or many other softwares. But perception has not changed much, because perception of an artist, of a photographer, is how he or she will use the space. That's very important, like a painter. So that space is very important. The photographer's eyes, his or her preference, that's very, very, very vital. But technology changes so many things. A lot of people, a lot of photographers nowadays says, oh my God, everything is now done in post-production, in photoshopping. I don't know, why not? Let a new images, new art is emerging, a new layering has been happening. I remember a brilliant cameraman, photographer Benu Sen and Shushanto Babu. They had done the similar kind of layering inside the dark room. But now people are doing it in Photoshop. What's wrong? Nothing wrong in it. The most important is your passion, your perception, and your vision. That is very, very important. I'm really delighted to see this exhibition, its display. Very innovative, very exciting. And thanks to Victoria Memorial for giving such a wonderful space they have. And I'm sure that people will enjoy the exhibition very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. This fest would not have been possible without the constant support and encouragement from our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Suranjan Das. I request him to come up and say a few words. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause, please.
My distinguished colleague, the eminent filmmaker, Mr. Gautam Ghosh, Professor Jayanta Sengupta, Director, Goethe Institut, distinguished members in the audience, which includes a number of esteemed colleagues of mine, and of course, my very dear students. I have primarily come here to thank all those without whose constant efforts this exhibition and today's program would not have been possible. First, my dear students, the members of Jadavpur University Photographic Club, who single-handedly organized this particular event. All credit goes to them. I really feel bad that due to our financial constraints and other constraints, on behalf of Jadavpur University Administration, we cannot provide constant financial help and other infrastructure help to them. But they have gone out of their way to prove their worth, to prove their ability, to prove their expertise, to prove their dedication to the cause of photography. I always say the students of Jadavpur not only excel in academics, but they also excel in activities outside the campus. This exhibition significantly demonstrates this fact. I congratulate the students, and I can say that so long as I will be in Jadavpur, I'll try to do my best to help you in organizing future exhibitions, both in the campus and outside the campus. Secondly, I'd like to thank my former student and currently one of the most distinguished personalities of the city, Professor Jayanta Sengupta, and his colleagues in Victoria Memorial for kindly providing us the space to organize this exhibition. But I think the university will also be the other area, other space where this exhibition will be shifted. And without Jayanta's help, this would not have been possible. On my own personal behalf and on behalf of the university, I sincerely thank you for all the help. I also thank the Goethe Institut for providing the lending hand, without which again the exhibition would not have been possible. I also take this opportunity to put on record our special thanks and gratitude to Mr. Gautam Ghosh for being with us today. I can assure you that your presence today will remain a source of sustenance and strength for all my students who, as I said, have put tireless efforts to make this exhibition reality. I won't take much of your time except perhaps to pose a question, taking the cue from Mr. Ghosh. What are the uses of photographs? There are certainly many uses of photographs. Photographs are both private and public utilities. But for a student of history like me and also surely for Jayanta, photographs today are being increasingly considered as an important source material for constructing and reconstructing collective and public memories. To a historian, photographs shape not only what we remember, but also how we remember. And increasingly in historiography, it is becoming important not only to record what we remember, but how we remember. And photographs provide us with a very important source material in that context. I'm here reminded of a very famous historian's quote, and I quote, "Photographs can be seen as visual manifestations of processes in history and environment," unquote. Picturing the past through photographs therefore creates possibilities of collaboration, possibilities of cooperation between the practitioners of history and what we now call photojournalism. The present exhibition, as I see it, is an evidence of this. Interestingly, I should also perhaps be failing in my duty to remember the audience that this magnificent building, which we all laud, in which this exhibition has been organized, also coincided with the process of successful colonial penetration into our country. And the making of this great building was steeped in imperial arrogance and extravagance. And as we celebrate the exhibition, perhaps we did not ignore this vital perspective. I did not go beyond this point. But I'm sure that after going through the exhibition, you will agree that photographs aptly enables us to capture and recapture nostalgia, memorable memories, inspiring objects and sceneries, and most importantly, such capturings and recapturings are usually done spontaneously, as Mr. Gautam Ghosh reminded us. And the spontaneity imparts a particular meaning to the photographs as a source material to historians. Could I end with a quote from a very famous Western commentator, and I quote, "Beauty can be seen in all things. Seeing and composing the beauty is what separates the snapshots from the photograph," unquote. Perhaps this could be the context in which the panel discussion might be organized. Perhaps this could be the context in which we look at the wonderful photographic exhibition that my students put up. Congratulations, students. You have really made me proud. You have really made Jadavpur University proud. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. This Photofest would also not have been possible had Goethe Institut Max Mueller Bhavan not considered a group of students capable of conducting such a fest of such expansive dimension. Mr. Frisco Macker has been very kind on many occasions and extended his support for this event. I welcome you, sir, on stage to share a few words about the potential and possibilities of this fest. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together.
Thank you very much. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and a great pleasure for me standing here in front of one of the most prestigious buildings of the city, on one of the most visited places of the city. For us as Goethe Institute, it's a great honor to be associated to the first edition of this festival. And I can also only felicitate all those who have worked tirelessly in order to make it come true. Just the other day we had a talk on alternative spaces in the framework of the SEMA Awards Kolkata Art Festival. And we all agreed that, especially for me as a German, when I think of alternative spaces for art, I think of Berlin. But as I very deeply feel, this city, I am sure, has many more spaces that could be used for art and the display of art. One of it being obviously the Victoria Memorial Grounds. And another thought which I think makes this also a brilliant initiative, and also I would very much like to thank Victoria Memorial for giving the grounds for it, because I think one can always ask oneself if it is the people who have come to the art, or is it the arts that come to the people. And I think for Victoria Memorial Grounds, it's certainly the latter, and you see so many people who come here in any case who would maybe not necessarily go to an exhibition which would be presented in a white cube. So I think it's great to display wonderful pieces of art in an open space, in a space where people feel at home. So I can only say that I very much look forward to the coming days of this festival and the masterclasses. I'm proud to announce that there's also a German photographer, Boris Eldarson, who is here with us. Thank you very, very much for coming. And I wish the festival in its first edition the best of luck. And I hope to see many, many more editions in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. We are also highly grateful to Dr. Jayanto Sengupta for allowing us to use the hallowed space of Victoria Memorial for the first JUPF. We would love to hear a few words from Dr. Sengupta. Sir, would you please?
Honorable Vice Chancellor of Jadavpur University and my teacher, Professor Suranjan Das, Sri Gautam Ghosh, Frizo Maker, the director of the Goethe Institut, Mueller, Bhavan, all the distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and my very dear students. It's a privilege and honor for us to be associated with the first Jadavpur University Photofest. As Professor Das said, you have done not only Jadavpur University proud and the city proud, but you have also made Victoria Memorial Hall proud. It's our pride to be associated with such an innovative and such an excellent photo festival. It's been a long time since we have had exhibitions of public art in these grounds, which, by the way, are not hallowed grounds, not anymore. We are trying to open it up for more and more exhibitions like this. And so when my teacher, Professor Suranjan Das, first proposed that we be associated with it a few months ago, it seemed to be a unique opportunity for us to resume our public art program and also to renew my personal connection with Jadavpur University, which run very, very deep. I have been, I have taught in that university for many years. So it's a great moment for us. It's an excellent exhibition, as you can see. It will be on display right up to the 5th of March. And we are extremely grateful for not only Jadavpur University, but also the Goethe Institut Mueller Bhavan to partner with us in this venture. And we are deeply grateful to Sri Gautam Ghosh for coming and really expressing his support for this exhibition. So now that we have opened these grounds, which are not hallowed, as I repeat, to such public art, I'm sure this will open the way for more exhibitions of this kind in the future. So like all of you, I look forward to an exciting round of conversations on art, on archiving, on photography, in the keynote address and the panel discussion that follows, and then seeing this exhibition, enjoying this exhibition over and over again for the next few days. Thank you so much again. Especially congratulations to Jadavpur University Photographic Club for mounting this excellent exhibition and giving us an opportunity to bring it on display to the public. We are the most visited museum in India by a long, long margin. So we are really glad that a large number of visitors get the opportunity to appreciate and enjoy good art as articulated in these excellent photographs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I stand corrected. We would now like to felicitate all the eminent dignitaries on stage. It is now time for the keynote address. We are extremely fortunate and delighted to have Mr. Rahab Alana amongst us as the keynote speaker. Mr. Alana is the curator of Al-Qazi Foundation for the Arts in New Delhi and fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of London. He is also the eminent editor of Pics, India's first theme-based photography quarterly magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause, please, as I request Mr. Alana to take the stage.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to confess that I'm feeling slightly disembodied because I need to be with the computer and show you some slides, but I also need to be here So just give me a minute before we can work this out. So I would like to thank the university and the panel. I think there are many ways in which what I have to say will segue into what has already been said, but mine is going to be slightly more elaborate. So please make yourselves extremely comfortable in your chairs, settle in, and if you can, try to move a little bit closer towards that screen which is supposed to show you slides. And it's very hard for you to see. So I'm going to make an effort to describe what is being shown on the screen, and maybe try to tie in with a lot of the things that have been said, all of which are very, very pertinent, especially today. So, the Jadavpur University has chosen the thematic of home, and I believe that this is, in one way or another, driven by a very humanist understanding of all the migrations that have always been, may always be, part of our search of where to reside. But nevertheless, a significant one. By a generation, this generation, that is inevitably coming to terms with what it means to be seen, what it means to be witness, what it means to be the recipient of colossal histories, of images that are strolling across the planet at any given moment. Our time, this time, is a myriad. It is a trickster. It is a simulator. It is a forgerer. It is also an enhancer of all that we have known by virtue of the images that we share. I have been thinking about what images desire of us, of people, and what has taken us to take on this mantle of truths over time. A suggestion that everyone can and does make these images in order to regenerate, to reimagine, to document oneself in time. In an article that came out for a word that was coined in 2016, which is post-truth, the intimation was thus: the afterlife of an image is driven by what we implant in that image. And maybe that has very little to do with truth. It is about what we seek, what we find through them. What do we find through them? Is it an encrypted message? A hidden biography? All of these are tropes of a contemporary strategy to transgress the known territories of facts and to arrive at a truth that is born of fiction, of realities that are conjured up all the time. Is it the tenuous zone of time and memory? Is it shared? Is it collective? Or is it my own? Is it about me? In an era of information overflow, data retrieval, some people call it demonetization, some people call it hacked elections. How do we decide what the line between an image and a message is? And whether the great arc of history is in fact fixed or credible? In an age of imagistic innuendos, visual simultaneity, montage realities, constructed surfaces, firewalling technologies, is there an alternative that we have arrived at? One in which every image is contestable, rethinkable, deferrable. It's a porous surface. It's a breachable frame. It's a shuffling context. One of the images that I am showing you on the screen right now, which you cannot see and maybe for good reason, is a hologram of protesters in front of the Spanish Parliament that was shot in 2015. There were no people in front of the Parliament. It was a screen that was put up and they were just moving across on the screen. A social movement that was generated through the press of a button. An artwork that challenges the existing artifacts, objects that foreground an absence. These are surreal moments, but they are real-time situations. And they present in our present a truth that is no longer fixed when the lines of authorship, when the lines of originality are constantly breached. It is a mutable world, but the question is it an acceptable world? And so I ask you now about the very first image that was impressed on a surface by light. What was that image exposed to light? What was the first image that was registered on Earth that provided a sense of presence? If you go very, very close to the screen, you might actually see what it is, but it is the impression of a hand. It is an impression made 30,000 years ago. It gives evidence of an identity that is construed through touch. It is translated into an image of presence, ironically today, absence. The same impression that in different cultures means different things. The hand, Abhaya Mudra, fearless in the eye of the storm. The Hamza, protection against evil. In Christianity, benefaction, declaration. A whole litany of gestures exists in mudras, in presences, in an image. And so today, what is that but a sense of identity? In an exhibition that was called The Untold Intimacy of Digits, there was the hand impression of one gentleman from Bengal. It is the hand impression of Raj Kunai that was shared with William Herschel, scientist, statistician, and he was a revenue official in the Bengal government. In 1858, this hand impression was shared with Mr. Galton, Francis Galton, who was a eugenicist. Fingerprinting experiments and technologies about the handprint, about identity, emerged out of this handprint for time to come. And as the nation embarks on a unique identification database and plans to have 1 billion counted, we must ask ourselves, how much of ourselves do we share? How much of ourselves do we want known? And for whom? Can we then begin to imagine the idea of framing that is developed outside the need for bracketing a fixed image? What I am now showing you on the screen is a bronze from the 19th century in Andhra Pradesh. It is an anthropometric, almost rather an anthropomorphic sense of what a frame is. The frame is coming to life, it has hands. But within the frame there is nothing. Filling an image with literally light, it passes right through an image of a blank frame where there can be no evidence that there is only one reality, only one definition, only one monolith, that we must reconstruct our own meanings at the very core and ask, what makes this image, that image, any image worthy? Or is it just the way I see things, how I show things to you? And so identity is at the forefront of the montaging of personal lives, inscribed onto now today a digital platform in which information overflow, data starvation are very much about the unpacking of secrets. The illusion of unconditional truth, absolute transparency, unrestricted freedom, and unfettered lives. These are ideals that may be strived for. They must be desired. And when I think of a person, do I think of him or her as a surface reading? Are we all more than images shuffling on a screen? And how do we become bearers of those images that are shuffling on screens? What do they do to us? There are whistleblowers, there are covert operations, there are surveillance mechanisms being deployed across the world, telling us that evidence, reporting, imagery are at the very core of an interpersonal media, where the private and public lose sight of each other all the time. But this draws nourishment and sustainability as in no other era has the personal life of a photographer, a documenter, or a compiler been so celebrated, yet so confounded. Who is the architect of an image made from other images? And so when we do come to images, we come to the question of intentions. What is it within the image that desires us again to look? What I'm showing you now on the screen is a 19th century, perhaps the first 19th century photograph of eunuchs, of transsexuals that was shared in India. It brought beauty, and I think a lot of questions about photography are about aesthetic, about beauty, but I think this image brought beauty to another kind of a threshold. It suggested that everyone who could strike a pose should strike a pose. That everyone is included in the citizenry of the camera, and eventually it will be an invitation, it will be an invocation that will draw you and me in. And so who are we in these private albums, in these torn photographs, on hard drives, and perhaps ingrained in each other's minds? Can we relate this relationship between you and me to a love affair? What I'm showing you now on the screen is a Pahadi painting of Radha and Krishna in which they are cross-dressing. Each one has adorned the clothes of the other. I suggest you do try this at home if you get a moment. Because not one or the other in this image of cross-dressing Radha and Krishna is more or less than the other. An image of complete balance, maybe even complete irony, but devotion. Devotion to one another. How does one achieve the secular culture that is part of our images from inside images? What will come from the depiction of known anomalies? How can we envision something real? So I take the next image to the evening of Radha and Krishna, where they come together in a forest. They literally collide as lovers, gently, amorously, complete, utter self-expressed submission. But looking at the viewer, if you look at their eyes, they stare right back at you. They invite you into the thicket, into the night, into their private world, into a secret that exists between two people for that one moment, that moment which is a moment of learning, a pictorial world, an impression of sheer fantasy upon the image of something real. In the 19th century, this sense of pictorialism was very much part of photographers and photography initiatives. There was one gentleman by the name of Shapur and Bhedwar, and this resonates with someone who brought up Alfred Stieglitz. He was part of the fin de siècle movement, which was associated with atmospheric compositions. The European counterparts would have been Paul Bregan, Frederick Henry Evans, all of whom produced photogravure work. But I bring him up because he belonged to a group very much like your club called the Brotherhood of the Linked Ring. And I'm showing you some images of his series. The Brotherhood of the Linked Ring, as has been suggested today, was against snapshot photography. It was against the ease of the instantaneous photograph. It constructed its imagery very much based on the paintings also. And in 1893, Alfred Stieglitz published this work produced in India, in New York, in camera work. It was very much part of a globalized world, the circulation of images. And they came up with, and I suggest that the Jadavpur think about this, another movement which was called the Secessionist movement, like the Salon des Refusés. How do we reject and accept different images into our editorial practice? What is not worthy of an inclusion might be worthy of an inclusion elsewhere. Was this a kind of performance? You brought up the Victorian era as well. You brought up a sense of monoliths today. Was it a sense that there is a noble savage rescuing those corrupted by idleness, by the fatigue of the modern, by the everyday, by mechanical reproduction? The Bengal Photographic Society over here was the first to be established anywhere in India. It was established in 1856. And what they did do is debate what the idea of a good image is and should be. One of the first individuals to be brought into the mainframe of the Bengal Photographic Society was this gentleman, Maharaja Ram Singh II. He was himself a portraitist and the subject. He was the photographer, the documenter, and the object in front of the lens. He dressed up in various garbs in the 1860s and brought the very basis of objectivity into question. What is my understanding of myself? How do I see myself? Why? He, in a way, domesticized photography as a resounding personal statement. He was also one of the first documenters of women in his court from the 1860s, which I will show you now. He brought to the lens a sense of intimacy, a sense of respect. But it brings to mind notions of social mobility, of gendered identities, and how they are cast in images. The idea of self-reflexivity, what is my place, comes to light even in the tradition of the embellished image, the painted photograph. And I particularly like this one, if you can see it. It brings to mind the idea of the Ragini Dhansari, a woman of dark complexion, painting the portrait of her companion, sitting right in front of her. But she is staring right back at the viewer. She is asking us to think about what it means to see. Our gaze upon an image. What happens to that when it is staring right back at you? The clashing of a gaze. What happens when we juxtapose her with the image on the left-hand side of the first modern Indian painter, Amrita Shergill, striking the same pose taken decades apart? Or the image of Ravi Verma that you find in front, narrating the story of Usha and Chitralekha. Usha was the daughter of a king that dreamt one night of a prince, of course, rescuing her. She then asked Chitralekha to produce portraits of a local prince, of her future husband. Ended up being Anirudh, the grandson of Krishna. In Ravi Verma, however, we see that Chitralekha is seated on the floor producing images, showing love-long expression, showing also a kind of narcissism for herself. But is that narcissism, or is it subjectivity, or is it performativity? Is it me inside someone else? This was played out very realistically, a sense of me inside someone else, in Calcutta, in the high courts, in the early 20th century, with some of these images. This is the case of the Bhaval Sannyas. He disappears, the Ram, I think his name is Ram Narayan Roy, who is the Bhaval Sannyas, goes to Darjeeling to be cured. It's a king that disappears, reappears many years hence. Therein begins the longest court case that is fought in the Calcutta High Court to prove the identity of the person. What is brought to bear at this point of time are photographs. A photographer is sent from the court, an artist is sent from the court, and a psychologist is sent from the court. The court case lasts about 16 years. We have these photographs in our archive in Delhi, so you must come and see them. They are used as evidence for the plaintiff. 16 years hence, the Bhaval Sannyas wins the court case. 2 days after winning the court case, he dies. The question is, what greater power can an image have than effect a law which underwrites our own right to being ourselves? A law of the land, is not only the law of the people, it is the law of the dominion. And what is this dominion? I was curious to show you material that we have, which shows antiquarian maps of Calcutta from the 18th century. It is to give you a sense that there was the coming at this point of time when identity was contested. It is also the coming of the modern Indian metropolis. It is also the time of some of the largest photo festivals that are held right here in Calcutta. Volunteering work from Australia, China, England and Egypt. This is all in the 19th century. But along with Calcutta, there are other photo groups that start establishing themselves very, very significantly. They end up in Peshawar, in Pune, in Secunderabad. They end up in places such as Hyderabad, Jaipur, Jodhpur. Town planning initiatives are initiated. They become centers of world commerce. It all comes with the sensibility, the modern sensibility of questioning one's identity. Who am I? But some of these images also highlight a problematic. The problematic at this point of time being that the empire is expanding. With that expansion comes a frontier. These are images, by the way, from Calcutta that we have from 1945, taken by an American Army general who is stationed over here. I can show them to you later as well. But the frontier is very significant. The photographers in the 19th century, apart from documenting who they were, had to create rendered versions of the landscape and show how their homes actually became the frontiers in their battle for land and in their battle for resources. War photography was one of the biggest propaganda vestments that comes to light at this point of time, deeply connected with traditions that are artistic, but that are also archaeological, anthropological. Sweeping testimonies of the frontier make us realize that what we are not looking at sometimes are images of great devastation, images of famine, images of destruction, such as this one. The harrowing image of the Madras famine of the 1870s. 10.3 million people perish at this one point of time, and they are posed here as though in a classical tableau. Many years later, of course, someone mentioned Sunil Jana. He takes up his first photographic commission for the Bengal famine that you see over here for Life magazine. Accompanying P.C. Joshi, General Secretary of the Communist Party of India. Jana's photographs of the famine were published around the world. He worked a lot with Margaret Bourke-White. He created a living testimony of what it means to be seen as something that is lifeless, that is a ghost-like figure. Can it be compared with the sculptures of Somnath Hor that are associated at the same time with the same famine? A haunting kind of lifelessness. But this is also the time of change. Modernism comes with its own changes. What we have in the archive are perhaps some of the most significant unpublished works of the Congress Party from the time of the civil disobedience movement in the 1930s. And I'm showing you all of these things. Demonstrations, lathi charges, salt satyagraha, Dandi, because they are not just images that are being captured by the lens. They are perhaps suggesting to us that resistance has been a very, very important part of the visual arts. A constructive resistance with productive problematics. Can this sensibility also then be taken to a book that was published just last week on Kashmir by Yarbal Books, about peoples whose homes are constantly unsettled, where photography works as a powerful witness in troubled times. And so this book, with the work of Javed Shah, Mehrajuddin, Akhtar Yassin, Javed Dar, Altaf Qadri, Sumit Dayal, Shaukat Nanda, Shahid Sehriyar, Azan Shah. They are insightful. They are unsettling. Some of them are even beautiful. But they raise profound questions about the place of artistic practice in zones of conflict. And in this case, that is Kashmir. But I wanted to show you some images, again, of a recent acquisition of ours, which is a 19th century album of Palestine. That you're not able to see here, but you can assume that it is a land that is brought today to its knees. This document almost shows the tattered remains of a very important history that is disappearing. It is our responsibility, perhaps, to make it reappear. And so familiarity, dissonance, passivity, these are the shifting fault lines of a generation that is consumed by evoking our sense of the tangible, our sense of the real. In order to arrest this sensibility from complete fragmentation, as your thematic, home, itself draws upon the idea of being immersive, an inner calling. The harvest then should also be about our relationships with human beings, individuals, communities, spaces that anchor us. But what happens when they begin to truncate us? And so to pose questions of affiliation, as you had done through home, where and why one is situated, either physically or by temperament, is a perpetual shifting scale. Politically it is shifting, visually it is shifting. And by transcending borders between countries that have a shared memory, images are drivers of a campaign to ally the mind with a mutable world, a global migration of images. But it is a sieve of practices that tells us that the configuration of photography today is tenuous. It remains uncharted. It remains bracketed. Is it about mirroring our own aesthetics? And so I take at this point of time some recourse in the sensibility of William Blake, who talked of a cleansing, but not this kind of cleansing. Rather, the opening of the doors of perception in order to see how things are. And things are infinite. Hence, the force field around identity weakens, but it becomes more porous, makes us more powerful. Is the afterlife in what we do, what we leave behind? The first ever photograph taken was this one. You can barely see it, but that was the idea. It was from a home looking out of a window. Nicéphore Niepce, the creator of this, said, we might leave an image behind that mirrors us. When we look into a mirror, we might leave ourselves in front of that mirror. But a view through a window that is a passage from one space to another, a home that is a place of resting, but also a place of invitation. We must open up this invitation to as many as possible. I will end with this one image that came out in social media the other day. It is by Airbnb. It is, of course, an image in the face of an administration that is trying to suggest that people should remain outside. I think we know which administration this is. We should not allow one man or one voice to drown out who we are as people and how we live together. And so in this era of insecurity, yet deep personal resilience, in this era of hate, yet deep needed compassion, in the second decade of the second millennium, in the 7th year, this is the 24th day. And this is the day on which Jadavpur University celebrates home. And it was always the case that the most radical ideas of our times would come from the university. Latin, universitas, meaning the whole. Harsha, the curator of this, the meaning of Harsha, delight. In the whole, we delight. I thank you very, very much for the invitation and for this beginning. Thank you.
We would now like to felicitate you, sir, so could you please come back up on stage? Since the Photofest germinates from a university, we have always wanted to integrate discussion and debate into photographic practice actively. On this note, JUPF has organized a panel discussion on the topic Art as Archive. Archiving is becoming a mode of existence in a world where images are infinite and change is the only constant. We have amongst us today Mr. Sanjay Mukhopadhyay, ex-professor, Department of Film Studies, Jadavpur University, Mr. Anindo Sengupta, Assistant Professor, Department of Film Studies, Jadavpur University, Independent Photographer, Mr. Ronnie Sen, and Dr. Ranu Roy Chaudhary, Assistant Professor, School of Historical Studies, Nalanda University. Mr. Mahargo Chakraborty has agreed to moderate the session. I now request him to take the program forward from here.
Hello, welcome all. I would just simply first like to invite the speakers onto the podium because I think we should start the discussion right away without delaying. So I will speak about the archive, of course, but I think the discussion should come up immediately, please. Let me introduce them. I don't think they need introductions, but let me introduce them nonetheless. One of our first speakers will be Professor Sanjay Mukhopadhyay, who's, a teacher. Other than that, he's been a storyteller, and he's sort of an icon within the university space, so to speak. He's just retired, but one can hardly ever imagine him retired from our world. The next speaker will be Sanjay Da, of course, who's again a beloved teacher, and one would also believe a comrade in arms, so to speak, in these, with similar political thoughts and similar concerns about social justice. We also have Ranu Roy Chaudhary, who has been a historian of photography and will, very interestingly, be speaking about the photographic practice and its use, if I'm not mistaken, in archiving. Of course. The speakers will, of course, figure out their routine. And lastly, and not the least, we have Ronnie Sen, whose work, I have to pause for a bit here and confess that I've always wished to meet him in person because I've been a fan of his work for a really long time. I would especially mention this one book of his, Khmer Din, which if you haven't taken a look at it, you have to take a look at it. It's these series of monochrome images which will completely change how you look at images, so to speak. So it's pleasure introducing him here as a photographer who will be speaking here. I do not want to, have a long introductory discussion here. So I would simply like to contextualize what I think we are pitching this discussion at, and I would refer to this little exchange that I had with one of the organizers here when I was asking for, a sort of a note as to what should be or how should one begin this conversation. And out of that discussion, the two words, they sent me a text, and two words that emerged out of it, two phrases, so to speak, which seem extremely important today. And I think that's one of the places where we would like to pitch this discussion to, are in fact, the first one is this term called the Anthropocene, which one of them has used, and the other is this very interesting turn of phrase called the death of cinema. Now, both of these concepts are rather out there, right? I am deliberately pitching this discussion out there because if we don't pitch it out there, we will not have a conversation here. right? So I'm deliberately pitching this really wide with these really diverse, but perhaps not so diverse concepts where the death of cinema debate has been very popular recently, and it refuses to die down, even though it's not a very old debate. But for someone as prolific as Martin Scorsese keeps repeating the phrase again and again every time he makes a film. So it was said during Hugo, then he said it during Silence, and this time his film has been very interestingly picked up by Netflix, which will completely produce it and distribute it, which is The Irishman. And he says, cinema as we used to know it doesn't exist anymore. This is a new direction. So one can take this debate into various directions. I'm not particularly interested in the turn of phrase, right? But what the turn of phrase means, this new way of looking at production, distribution, and consumption. At the same time, I would also like to draw attention to this one word that this discussion has been using, which is the Anthropocene, which is a very interesting word, because the Anthropocene, it's not really at that level very complicated as a word. The Anthropocene is, as geologists have defined it, is a definite strata of the epoch. For example, if I give you an example of, let's say, Holocene or the previous epochs, the Mesozoic, these are epochs in history, right? So geologists have taken this argument to that extent where they have argued that we must now make space for a new epoch where human activity has irrevocably changed geography, climate, everything around us. So much so that it has to be defined by a new strata in time, right? If we are trying to bring these two really, as I said, out there points together here, when we are talking about the archive, the notion of the archive itself then becomes very, very interesting. The archive has always been a much debated term, right? And of course, people will define the topic today, art as archive. People will take this discussion in various ways, according to which perhaps medium they are talking about archiving or what sort of an archive they are thinking of generating, right? But if we look at the history of the term archive itself, what could be called an archive has gone through a series of changes as perhaps ways of looking at what is a document has changed. So what you can call a document today is such a wide range of terms. So anything actually can be a document. So anything that pertains to information, knowledge, right? Anything that contributes to a repository of knowledge can perhaps today be called a document. So that can be a film, that can be a ledger, that can be a, let's say, receipt from 100 years back. Anything really can be a document. And you add to this the domain of the digital that you cannot deny now. So not just in what you call a document, but how you store that document. So the idea of a digital archive, where the archive is simultaneously there. So there is perhaps a physical archive, there's a physical space, there's a room with servers and cabinets and everything. And at the same time, there is no physical archive, the entire thing is in the clouds, right? So what is an archive? What would you call an archive? How do you archive? What sort of documents are admissible? What sort of documents are not admissible? Right? If you look at the history of what someone would call an archive, there have been so many remarkable interventions, and the two most foremost that have to be mentioned primarily because these are the two nodal points from which every successive discussion has somehow emerged. They would, of course, be, Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, and they have taken the idea of the archive, and I do not want to go into an extremely thick discussion of what they view as the archive, but the one common little tone that emerges from both of their discussion is what you do not call the archive. So when you make something as an archive, when you collect a set of materials and call this as an archive or a repository of knowledge, you are automatically, of course, making a choice of not including perhaps another set of things, which you chose not to include in this aforementioned catalog. And immediately then you are excluding a set of things from this archive, right? So there can be no singular definition of an archive today. At this juncture, there can be none. We are at a cusp where strange things have come together, strange vectors have come together. So there's the entire digital landscape, right, where everything is, there are now debates of what is admissible, what is not admissible, what is material, what is not material, what sort of information, what sort of image, because there are so many. Which one would you actually include in a traditional historical archive, right? Coupled with that, there are questions of perhaps mortality now, because the idea that the entire species might face a disastrous extinction level incident is not just simply anymore at the level of discourse. It's come out to the level of the real, right? So there can be possibilities of world scale or global incidents which will jeopardize or might jeopardize the human race in a significant way. That is no longer at the level of theory anymore. There are actual possibilities. It has been demonstrated by small incidents, one after another, man-made or otherwise, over the past decades, right? And one can put, let's say, perhaps the Hiroshima bombing as another nodal point there. And at the same time then, the third vector that has come together is our present now, so to speak, where a sort of divisive, extremely intolerant way of looking at who is a subject, who is a citizen, who gets to speak, who doesn't get to speak, whether everyone should get to speak. These questions are being pitched at the level of the nation, which then becomes a bit of a problematic zone to sustain the conversation in, because if you're already taking it to the level of an ideal, right, the ideal citizen of a nation, and if I may use these terms to just open this discussion into various different directions, then these various vectors then come in, and the question now remains as to what do you preserve. If the archive is about preservation, if the archive is about conservation, then what do you conserve? How do you conserve? And what do you conserve for? Who do you conserve for? Because then you're obviously, if you're conserving, if you're saving something, if you're putting something in a knowledge domain and hoping that someone will access it, right? Because there is democratic access to the archive. Everyone gets to access knowledge, or so to speak, everyone gets to, or everyone is supposed to get to access knowledge. Then who are you making this new archive for? So this is where I would simply like to stop, and I'm sure our eminent speakers will take these discussions in their various ways, in their various practices, in the various ways they look at the archive into very interesting directions. So we will listen to them, and then we'll come back, of course, for a discussion, right? So is there an order that we have to follow, or anyone? I think, of course, as I said, Chandra has to begin, because it's always when we're telling a story, and the lore master has to begin first.
Thanks everybody. Thanks to Victoria Memorial Hall, Goethe Institute and Jadavpur University Photographic Club for inviting me and allowing me to take part in this discussion. I'm a little bit confused because to begin with, they said that you should talk on painting and talk about painting. I am not a painter, neither I am a filmmaker who paints. I am not a historian, so how to begin with it? Let me have a cue. So, as Rahab Alana a few minutes ago said about 1860, the moment of the salons and the fuse when Claude Monet, an impressionist painter, painted sunrise and impression. That was the moment which witnessed the clash of the titans. That was the beginning. in the beginning was the image, and the image began to make an internal struggle between them. Photography has already arrived. It learned and could show how to manifest the external. And there appeared the Impressionists, like people like Claude Monet, Edgar Degas, Edouard Manet, and others, who, in a fashion almost like a rival, wanted to prove that there may be an insider story of reality as well as there may be an external one. They directly deviated from the traditional course of painting in the sense that they were the first group of painters to denounce the integrity of drawing. They say light should be foregrounded. It is light which should take the central protagonist role. The same thing happens in photography. And as you know, Claude Monet was refused. He was rejected by the Salon because he initiated a kind of discontinuity, some cracks within the available real to inject a sense of the insiderness. That how did it all begin? Can art itself constitute an archive? Painting may be archived. That we all know. You can have museum, you can have so many galleries, and you have visited so many galleries all over the world. I am not speaking about those things. You can archive the paintings, you can archive the lost materials, the colors, and everything. You have every right to. That can give you a sense of historical data and a sense of belonging to a specific time period. But I am speaking of other things. Sorry, I have no materials to present, but you all witnessed those moments when you saw those great pieces of painting. Let's start with two very known paintings. Everybody has seen them. One, The Night Watch, 1642, and this second, Las Meninas, 1656. What do they basically do? The first was painted by Rembrandt, a Protestant, a Dutch painter, and the second one by Velázquez, a Spanish painter. Both are extremely famous. They are considered as theology of paintings. Why theology? Because they tell you some inside story of the real. What do they tell? What do they inform us today when we confront these great pieces? You see, they are basically group paintings, but they tell you something which are really secrets, which should be invaded, which should be decoded in order to have a grasp of the contemporary situation or any other situation. Unless you can compare and contrast, unless you can situate the contemporary within a believable coordinate, axis and coordinate, you won't be able to get rid of the abstraction. Let me start from another very famous film. Perhaps you have seen that. Pierre Le Fou, the Jean-Luc Godard, a 1965 film. It all began with Elie Faure's discussion of Velázquez. It started with Belmondo reading the lines. When he reached, I quote, when he reached the age of 50, Velázquez refused to draw anything which is concrete. And some line after, it was a discourse in the evening. And he was clearly referring, Jean-Luc Godard was clearly referring to the last Meninas, to the insider's view of the royal family. Why the painting is so important? Why do we call it a theology? Because it is the most precious moment in modern art. when the artist took a most humble position. He refused to be a god, an omnipresent character. He refused to paint what is there. Of course, there was the royal family, the infantas, the dwarfs and others. It was inside a Spanish chamber. But carefully, if you look at the painting, you would see Velázquez himself observing the painter painting the whole situation. As he was saying, it was the observer observing the observed. It was the moment of epiphany in painting. The history was encapsulated. And if you take this moment, the prince incognito, observing everything, you'd feel that when Goethe was trying to compose the anarchy in and around Paris middle class scenario in 1965, he was left with no alternative but to take recourse to a kind of moment in painting which archived the historical desolation and the inevitability of an impending disaster. That was it. And if you come to the night watch, what is it? Basically a group photograph. It literally gives you 23 characters, and it can tell you so many things, how people lived and died during that period, what was the nature of costume, how did they like to talk, and so on and so forth. That we are not interested. Why the night watch or the portrait of Captain Banningcock, the real name of the painting, became so famous? Because it contains some errata for which the painting was refused by the contemporary civilization, by the purchaser, because he was clearly dissatisfied. He commissioned for his portrait, for the portrait of his group, but did he see? It was something, a method in mad. It was something like method in madness, like Hamlet. It has cracks, and through these cracks, modernity entered. A chicken, God knows why, a girl, and that heavenly light from midday to create that everything is in darkness. Denmark was a prison, so said Shakespeare in Hamlet, and Amsterdam was more than a prison, said Rembrandt in 17th century. These moments, unless you archive them, unless the paintings, the mode of painting, the representational order, which someone like Michel Foucault would like to posit as episteme. In fact, Foucault used the example of Las Meninas to foreground the episteme, the wisdom of an age, and the wisdom of vision. And unless you use this wisdom, this antiquity, in close collaboration with the kind of contemporary, you are nowhere. And paintings, I would say, that in themselves contain an archive which is not manifest reality. Rather, it contains some passage, an inside passage, which lead you to a zone which is more philosophical, contemplative, reflexive. When you think about yourself, how to enter into the zone, how to enter into the gallery, you become a character within the painting itself. This is a modern game, and painting, I think, began to play this game right from 1642, when Rembrandt completed the portrait of Captain Banningcock, popularly known as Night Watch. There I think painting can be used as archive and film more often than not. use this kind of references. Let us look at Charulata. When Soumitra was saying, "Ami chini go chini tomareo go videshi," the camera observed a Victorian painting, and it clearly referred to a specific periodicity. A periodicity when beauty had a certain glamour in order to be loved. So paintings, there are moments. In fact, the whole of Pierre Le Fou, the whole of Mascula Femina can be observed. In fact, you can look at La Règle de Joux, when Jean Renoir, the great son of Auguste Renoir, fought for the ideal how to make the portrait different from a model. He struggled a lot with light to create the difference, to archive the essential from the non-essential. And there you are, the photographic connotation in photography and painting are different. Goethe tried to photograph the night watch, and he, in a film like Passion in 1982, clearly admitted his failure, because in Passion he could stage light the way he liked to, by saying, "Rahul Kothar, put this light there, put this light there," but you never know how this light was created in night watch. What is the source? The source is unknown, and that is why the paintings should be archived, because the light that was never on sea or land, you would find it in paintings. I think paintings themselves can contain archives like this, and they become histories. Thank you.
I want to have the two speakers who will be speaking on photography together. So I'd like to invite Anindada to speak.
Thank you, Margot, and thank you everyone who is listening here and the organizers of this festival. Thank you for calling me. Actually, I'll be talking about things. I'll be talking about a kind of object which is really very transient and a contingent kind of object, and it's therefore I might be a bit speculative. I don't have much to say. So you can say that I've created an excuse for myself, talking about images which are not actually meant to be produced. I'm talking about, actually the organizers, they told me to talk about cinema as archive, but I thought that that's not necessarily something vast, but that's much discussed. So I'll be talking about certain things which I've been thinking of in recent times, because in my classroom situation these days, there have been certain kind of problems. Like we're observing that people are not attending screenings. Screenings are not attended much. Before, often the students, they in our classrooms, in our classroom timetable circle, the screenings are arranged at the fag end of the day. The students are much fatigued, tired by then, and they think that those films which will be screening, they will watch it later, and fair enough. If they can actually get by a copy of that film, they can watch it in their home. But the problem lies when often the students, they have not seen the film, a film which will come in our discussion, obviously in reference, and there are not even much screening times. Like it's happening in my undergraduate classes. The undergraduates, they have one screening in a week. and in each class I might be, there are 4 to 5 classes each day, and I might one class each day in 4 to 5 days, and I might have to discuss a film in each day. And then, therefore, I can't actually say that watch a film, watch this film, and come to the class next day, and it's not always possible. Then I try, in these days, I try to take a detour. I go and search in the name of the film in the web, and I don't go for the web search results, I go for the image search results. And therefore something happens like this, that I try to recreate the film in still images. Now when a film is shot, when a film is constructed, they are not necessarily constructed as still images. And that kind of sets us thinking in a certain way. Supposedly, any film, Chandra talked about Puelufu just a moment ago. Is it possible for me, in terms of kind of snapshots of the film, to create a kind of graphic narrative of the entire film, culled from the wave? What kind of still frames do we cull from the film? And then, actually, I did a bit of finding outs, and I saw that when a film is publicized, when a film is released, and it gets its publicity or something like that, you actually obviously create certain still frames which will stand as the memory of the film. And then these films, if you collect those frames, they are about certain dramatic or poignant, memorable moments of the film. But then, it might also happen that the way the producers, they think of snapshot of moments in a film, the viewers might actually recall totally different moments from snapshots of which can't be culled from the internet, if the internet is a kind of archive. I might be recalling a different moment at all over, and I am not getting any kind of still grab of that moment. So Mahargo was presenting the idea of death of cinema, and death of cinema has been much discussed. So these are the moments, and actually we people who are kind of cinephiles, we continuously think of a day when moving images might stop producing, and it will never happen. But a certain kind of idea of cinema might be not there. And that will also not happen, because you know that moving images are getting archived in the internet in a certain kind of way. So there is constantly this fear of something dying, something slipping away, but something which is out there for our retrieval. And this actually brings painful thoughts to me, because last week, actually because of my stupidity, there was a huge kind of virus attack in my PC, and I lost 25 GBs of PDF. 25 GBs of PDF, all encrypted by something which is very handsomely named Cerebus ransomware, and it told me that I need to fetch out $500 in Bitcoin to have a password which can retrieve all my files. So I had to reformat my computer. I'm still in a state of mourning. So digital data and digital objects, they don't necessarily guarantee permanence unless you have copies of it, in that sense. So even when analog is in cinema, and this is something insider's view of cinema, that when analog is considered to be obsolete and digital is the name of permanence, it's also exactly not in that fashion. So like in those peculiar situations, we might actually have to, when a DVD gets badly scratched and I couldn't show it to the students, or suddenly I think that a hard disk has got corrupted and there was a film there and I've lost it. So I have to take recourse to other archives, that is the internet, and think of those snapshots. Now, these snapshots, which is a strange intermediary between moving images and photographs. They were not meant to be photographs, but they are reduced to photographs. These still images of films. And then we understand that here also there is a process of hierarchy. There are certain moments which are actually grabbed in stills, and there are other moments which are lost. But in our practice, we can actually now, from the side of the users, we have the technology where we can produce those unarchived moments. Unarchived in the sense that they are not archived in still images. And we can actually have unarchived moments of those bits and parts of films, because the films, they might disappear. There might be certain films which we won't survive in a digital copy anymore, like Kulito Pasha. Most probably it's not retrievable anymore. And we might actually find the memories of the film which are there. And these memories are always visual memories. What is lost, what is kind of lost in this way, is the other aspect of cinema, that is sound. You can't have a snapshot of sound. And then, and this is often in the situation in the classroom, when I tell my students, and it happened yesterday actually, when I was speaking of a film which suddenly came up, and I told them, recall that moment when there was this dialogue. Something which you might recall, something which might not recall. In your memory, that dialogue might have changed into something else, and you might say, no, this was not said there, something else was said there. And it might happen like that, and something very peculiar might happen when you're recalling a French film, and neither you nor your student knows French, and you're recalling a moment that recall that dialogue in terms of only the subtitle, which might be mistranslated. So in this way, this moving images and their still siblings, in that sense, continuously actually gives us a sense of two things, of death and coming back to life. And we know archive means that. Archive means retrieving things which are lost or past, whose days are gone, bygone, and again reanimate them, coming back to life. And actually now, in that sense, cinema was actually more an apt medium that way, because cinema during the analog days, because during the analog days it was 24 frames per second, therefore 24 still images, therefore 24 dead images, and therefore 24 dead images brought back to life, but it's not life. The projection out there, it's not actually, it's ghostly. It's kind of eerie, ghostly things, and these ghosts are coming back to life. And often when I begin a course to set things going, actually set the mood going, and today I should actually thank Rahab Alana for setting the mood going. And when in your brilliant speech, and when you set up people thinking, people who are listening, they are in a better position, because people who are speaking, they are still thinking, and the words might get actually convoluted. And in that sense, so when I set people thinking during the courses we teach, and we have certain very gimmicky thing to tell, at least I do. Sanjay Da also had his set of kind of lines to tell, and I have my set of lines to set the mood for 2 years of MA course or something like that. That is, for the next 2 years he'll be living with ghosts, because more, the people we see on the screen, the black and white images, almost 3/4 of them are dead. And so, when we're watching them, we're mourning them, we're paying attention to the dead, we're recalling them. Dead people are coming back to life, and so on and so forth. So cinema has a certain connection to the archive, and I will end by mentioning something else, which I can't actually say something very conclusive or very something substantial, but it is something which I've been thinking a lot in the last 5 years or so. That is cinema as a kind of archive of emotions, and cinema as a kind of history of emotion. That is those famous moments like the climactic scene of Meghe Dagatara, where Lita says, "Dada mi bachte chahiye." She screams. Exactly the words, they say nothing. "Dada mi bachte chahiye," this word is encapsulating nothing. And when, or in Charulota, when Charu is looking at a little kid up there, an infant up there, and then panning to Amol, it's actually this language of camera says nothing conclusive. Actually, they are obscure. Actually, they are dense. These are dense moments where certain affect, certain emotions are getting archived, which can't be easily coded, and therefore we need to go on uncoding, decoding those codes. And there is a very, very beautiful Bangla word which is associated with Bengali poetry, and which comes back to my mind when I think of these moments. That is the word Shandho. The word which was coined to describe Chorjapot, from where Bengali poetry had its origin. And this is the Shandho Bhasha, which means a language which is like dusk. The moment we are going towards, when we don't know whether it's the evening settling down or the dawn. This kind of ambiguous moment where actually coded language were used. And these moments, they create a kind of Shandobhasha. And therefore, this idea of a moment which is not lucid, a cinematic moment which is not lucid, which is actually archiving a certain kind of emotion which was born during that moment of history. And it is up to these great artists like Ghotoka and Rai and others, and also might be also lesser artists in their better moments, who can actually capture the emotion in a certain configuration, in a certain composition, in a certain moment, which need not be lucid. It need not be a readable archive as such. And then therefore, we as people of posteriori, our task is to pursue that meaning, always approximate them, never to reach in the finalist moment. And I am thinking of cinema as a kind of archive of emotion, photography as an archive of emotion, and so on and so forth. So, with this open end, I might go to the next speaker. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anindada. I would now like to invite the, by popular demand, then the photographer himself who will speak, and then move on. Oh, and I've been corrected that he's a filmmaker too. So I was unaware. So now the interest is even more piqued.
Thank you very much. It's very awkward because both of them here, out of three, two of them are my teachers. I've done their classes and completely sort of not prepared at all for this talk. You know, with work and everything going on, it's a bit madness with 4-5 hours of sleep. So it's something that Rahab should just keep talking about for hours and hours, and we can all listen to him. But I'm very glad that JOPC had called me. So what I'm going to do is, I was just scribbling a couple of points that I would like to touch upon, about art, about archive, about my practice, and how these words made any sense to me at all. So, I mean, when we were just beginning, photography and looking at photography, it was mostly documentary work that we loved, which we saw from personal archives of photographers. We saw amazing work from the Magnum website, and a lot of my contemporaries, friends, colleagues are here, and they would also sort of relate to what I'm saying. When we were looking at photography, and we were the first generation who got the internet, and what it allowed was it gave us a new world which we had no clue of, and we could sense that the earlier generation had no access to this huge archive, this huge repository of images and so many other things. So in the context of photography, and in the context of me choosing to be a photographer, these archives, these websites, and the internet, it was instrumental, and it actually shaped up everything. I mean, we were slowly understanding what we should do, what we should not do, what we should look at, and so much which wasn't here. In the context of the city, I don't think I've ever seen a great exhibition in this city till now, And I've been a photographer here for more than 12, 13 years. We don't have museums, we don't have the galleries that Chandra was talking about. We have galleries, but it's only the internet which showed us that this is not how it should be done. And then one day I remember in 2008 or 9 or 10, 2009 or 10, Mr. Rahab Alana started PICS, and I was called in Delhi, and got very excited. So went to Delhi at the opening of this magazine, the first Photography Quarterly, and that was probably the first exhibition I'd ever seen in my life. I don't know if I've told you this. So, and those were the times when we were pretty mad about photography, and we were looking at all different kinds of work. Many of us here, Pratik, there is Shomo, there's so many photographers. So, what kept how we evolved has a lot to do with the kind of stuff we saw, and not the kind of stuff we saw here. It had mostly to do with the stuff we saw outside, which is accessible for the first time, which the earlier generation didn't have any access to. So, coming to archives and coming to history, and I remember looking at Tale of Three Cities by Pablo, and the beautiful way he had started archiving his personal work. That was the first moment in my life when I saw that, okay, you don't have to really do only social documentary and stuff like that to be able to establish yourself as a photographer. You can just shoot your friends enjoying, and that's it. So it was new. It was very new. We were very young, now, in retrospect, what I can understand is, and looking at other art forms and mediums and everything, is that history is made when people preserve what they love. You know, the moment you get bored, it's over. So, for example, if you're in Shantiniketan, if you have grown up in Shantiniketan, and you look at Ramkinka's sculptures, if you grew up looking at them, you know, in the outside, then you would never feel the need of, having a museum, you know. So, the moment you get bored with something, you don't keep it anymore. And no matter what, no matter how much effort you put in to preserve it, it's not going to stay. Say, Rahab only told me a long time back that the most popular forms of art practice being done in this country has been sort of sidelined as folk art. It's for the scholars and historians and archivists to look at these things. As a photographic practitioner, as a photographer, all I can say is that it's love which keeps the things there. You know, I heard one of my friends told me that there's one photograph of it's because Chandra told a very interesting thing that why do we archive or who do we do it for? We don't know. At times there's no answer because Ansel Adams, one of his photographs was in the space, and who is it for? You know? So we don't know, and there's no reason to know. Coming back to my practice, and coming back to the way we started sort of changing our practice slowly, steadily. These galleries and the festivals, which also began in the last 8 or 10 years, they had a huge impact. And we were probably the first generation of photographers in the country who didn't sort of do commercial work or photojournalism or whatever is left. I mean, a lot of us jumped at the art practice from the day one. But we don't know that how this is going to stay. Some of us are very fortunate to have the Al-Kazi Foundation, who are sort of generous to sort of acquire some of the work we have done. But in the long run, it's difficult, and it scares me, because I know myself, and I know that how irresponsible I am. I can't take care of my work. I've lost more than 30-40% of my work already. Anindada was talking about the digital and how he lost it. It's the same. I've lost negative, you know. And in Calcutta, it's not like Delhi. It's very humid. You can't keep your necks. Delhi is very dry, and you can still sort of find something. But anyways, that's a different discussion. Coming to the impact of archives, because that's the only thing I can talk about. I remember looking at this amazing exhibition by Homai Bariwala, the first photojournalist, woman photojournalist from India. And not a first show, the last one at Triveni, where you showed the new work. It was amazing. Just to look at photographs from her college, when she was at the JJ art school in Bombay, and what she was doing, and just the way she looked at the world and her friends, it was fascinating. And these little things shaped the way we started seeing. It had a strange sort of impact. So coming back to the city now, it's very strange because there's nothing to really sort of talk about, because in the context of Calcutta, I recently saw this, I'm digressing a little, I saw this little ad of tourism by Calcutta, something to do with tourism. They were trying to promote tourism in the city. And it was a video, and it began with the same old Howrah Bridge, the same old Victoria Memorial. I don't know why we are having this conversation here. The same old Shidur Khela, Durga Pujo, trams. And if you ask now that why these, it's because it's all celebration of a certain nostalgia. There's nothing else that we have done in the last whatever 50, 60 years. There's nothing to show. There's nothing to talk about. You know, it's the same things, the same visuals, just coming back again and again and again, and it's so boring. You know what I mean? So, but the thing is that the city has nothing to show. There are no galleries, as I said. There's no museum. There is no archive. There's no celebration of anything which we can do now. If you look at the second Hooghly Bridge now, they have made this welcome sign with little bulbs, and it looks ugly. So, I mean, I can go on and on and on, but the point that I'm trying to make is, even if we have to preserve things, we have to know how to do it the right way. This is not the right way. And yeah, so that is it. And what archives does in photographic practice, and how it helps photographers like me, is it sets certain patterns, you know, that you can start from where somebody else had left. Like, I know in my generation there was a huge influence of the Japanese black and white photography at one point. A lot of us have been very inspired by it, you know, the 60s and 70s. I mean, it's all a long 70s. There's nothing else to look back to anyways. But, so what I'm trying to say is that pattern, what it does for people like me is that it shows us a few patterns, and pattern is the mother of memory. You start from where somebody had left, and you can leave somewhere, and somebody else can start from there you have left, you know. And these archives, and looking, more looking, shows these patterns, which doesn't actually matter, because it doesn't matter. Even if it doesn't, it's all right. But the thing is that you can make sense of it, where it is coming from. Say, Dado Moriyama, why it is coming from William Clay, to why it is coming to Calcutta. It's very strange. But this is how it works, and it's for other people, it's for the city, it's for the government probably, or the society at large, to keep these things that all of us are doing. It's important. I don't know how they will plan, and I really don't care, but the thing is, we didn't see anything of it. Nothing at all. There's nothing. Even after 20 years, you're going to show the same Howrah Bridge and Victoria Memorial and have another thing here. Doesn't make any sense. That's all. Thank you.
I'd like to invite our final, not last but not the least, speaker, Ranu Roy Chaudhary.
Out of my 10 minutes, I'll take 2 minutes to fix my computer, 1 minute to mistype my password, and then I'm So I'll show you the photographs later. Just like right here. I would like to thank first Jadavpur University Photography Club for inviting me, and of course, as an alumni of Jadavpur, I must thank Victoria Memorial Hall and Goethe Institute for lending support to this fantastic event. And I was going through the exhibition a bit. I'll take more time to see it through properly. And it is an amazing display. And yeah, Rahab, you are absolutely right. This is fantastic. And thanks, Maharko, for introducing me. I would like to thank my co-panelists, and thanks to you all for being here today. So as we discuss art as archive in the context of first JU Photofest, we have a consensus that photography is a form of art. So I would like to take a step back in the 8 minutes that I have left to first historicize this categorization of photography as art, and then to reflect on photographs as archive. Let me begin by saying that aesthetic status of photography was contentious when the technology was first patented in 1839. And as a side note, I must emphasize that photography was neither invented nor discovered. The genealogy of both the optical principle and the chemical experimentation go way back than a specific date may suggest. So going back to my point about photographs as works of art, let me point out that practitioners, critics, and bystanders faced a crisis of judgment when the technology was patented and was made available to the public. Is photography a form of objective impartial documentation, or is it a form of subjective interpretive art? Is it merely a technology? Are photographs visual truths, evidences of reality, or are they representations? Are photographs material objects, or are they only aesthetic forms? Is the language of photography universal, or is it culturally specific? These are a few of the questions that generated long-standing debates among photographic practitioners and theorists across the globe since the first days of the medium. Questions that entered the South Asian public sphere in the mid-20th century, as Rahab had earlier suggested. And it was soon after the discussion had begun in England and in France. In specialist discourses and in popular perception, photography was not considered an art form because it was seen as a utilitarian craft, because it was believed that the camera only recorded reality. Photographs were indexical. They were considered not to refer to only to refer to the reality that had been in front of the lens. Mediated by a machine, photographs were not products of unique creativity and imagination of artists. Following this logic, photographers were camera persons, that is, technicians and not artists. Against this dominant discourse were many minor discourses that were committed to the idea of photography as a legitimate art form. And our host actually mentioned Stieglitz, and so did Rahab. And Stieglitz is a very interesting person in that, he began as a pictorialist, and he was in favor of trying to establish photography as a legitimate art form, and then an art form along with painting, and later on he would move on to talking about medium specificity, but we can talk about that later. So going back to the minor voices, so these minor voices that were now considered influential had myriad reasons for claiming photography's artistic potentiality. Of course, two most famous names we must turn to are William Henry Fox Talbot and Louis-Jacques Daguerre. Daguerre emphasized on diorama and panorama in tracing photography's genealogy, while Talbot famously, or perhaps infamously, said that photography could place visual representation in the hand of the artistically challenged. Daguerre was claiming photography's artistic status by locating it within wider practices of image making, and Talbot proposed to make art by replacing the hand of the artist. Through the second half of the 19th century, other practitioners and critics continued this debate. Even half a century after its invention, debates over the status of photography, its aesthetic value, and its utility were yet to be settled. Even during the heydays of pictorialism, like when Stieglitz began his photographs, in the late 19th and early 20th century, many in the art world would argue against photography's artistic potential. This argument about photography as non-art is reflected in the late entry of photographs in the major art galleries and museums, and in the relatively late development of an art market in photography. For example, New York's Museum of Modern Art, famously known as MoMA, mounted an exhibition of photography as late as 1937. That's pretty late, like almost after 100 years. And Sotheby's pioneered the regular auction of photographs only in 1971. Today, even when we accept that photographs are works of art, there is an implicit and often explicit hierarchy in what kind of photographs may count as art. And a while back, there was talk about snapshot vis-a-vis real artistic photography. So, and photographs are placed in different sorts of hierarchies. So what may count as photographs, what may not. And Ronnie a while back talked about that he was one of the first people who could jump to the art practice. And if I may quote rightly, yeah, jumped at the art practice, quote unquote, and quote again. And I did not have to do photojournalism or commercial photography, etc. Close quotes. So, and that is kind of interesting, and somehow in this case art is different from photojournalism, and once again we can go back to these issues later and talk more about that. But the point that I'm trying to make is there's an implicit hierarchy in what counts as art and what cannot count as art. So yeah, some photographs are art beyond doubt. I mean, yeah, we don't have to tell anybody. Well, others not quite my selfie probably. In other words, the underlying assumption is that photography is not inherently an artistic medium, and it is only through employing specific kinds of aesthetics, that is formal economy, that some photographs may attain the status of art. However, for people like the cultural critic Walter Benjamin, well, I'm really sorry to invoke Benjamin, but yeah, he's kind of the father that I cannot invoke. Writing in 1930s, the question for him was not whether photography was an art, but how photography transformed the potential of what art can do or what art can be. As people were debating over aesthetic status of photography, they agreed on one point though, that photographs are records of reality. But what kind of reality were they talking about? What do we talk about while talking about documentary photography or asserting documentary claims of any photograph? And once again, these are open questions, and we can revisit this question during when the floor is open. So as we stay, and Mohammed talked about Derrida once again. Apologies for invoking Derrida again. Well, no, I would say that, but there's a pun saying, I mean, Derrida is the brother of the famous Bengali character Tenida. Anyway, not involved in that anymore. As we stay mindful of the famous or perhaps infamous Derridian dictum that, I quote, "Nothing is less clear today than the word archive," close quotes. What may we expect while thinking about photographs as archive? What are photographs supposed to say, and what are we supposed to read in them? What would it mean for me as a historian of photography to say, "Let the archive speak"? Now, there is a remarkable similarity between photography and the idea of archive. Archive, both of them lay claim to indexicality. Photographs are organically related to their reference, while archives, as physical spaces, as material remains, and as discursive practices, is organic sign of time. And thanks, Raha, for bringing the question of time earlier in your talk. Archives claim to be neutral historical repository of information akin to the indubitable reality of photographs. Yet both are inherently meaningless. I must emphasize, they are inherently meaningless. Sure, that a photograph says 1,000 words, as a saying goes, but we would never know which 1,000 words it's speaking until we, as beholders and analysts, fix one out of many possible meanings onto it. Likewise, the meaning of the archive will depend on how it is read. Thus, meaning in both contexts is pretty fluid. Let me give you an example. So this morning I had a short conversation with my host, Bashida, and I was wondering how I would find her, given that I have never met her in person. She said that it would not be difficult for her to identify me because she had seen my photograph. Bam. I have seen your photograph, I quote Bashida. It was an incredibly intriguing statement for me. And she sounded pretty confident about the photograph she saw. The Facebook photograph that Bashida was using in this case was her archive. Now, how did she know that the photograph she saw was Ranu's? I mean, she probably saw my Facebook, she probably saw my faculty page, I don't know really, or maybe just searched me with Ranu Roy Chaudhary on Google and saw a photograph that she thought maybe of me. In either case, my image came with verbal descriptions. First, it said my name, and then it specified my academic activities that are part of my identity. Thus, Basita's conviction did not come only from the photograph. It came from the ways in which visual and a verbal text interacted, how photographs and extra photographic information coexisted. I changed my name on Facebook, and the photograph she saw will come to mean something else completely. So, what will happen when photographs are my archive? What kind of photographs should we look at? The sharp images or out of the focus blurred ones? The blurred that are not intentional. So some blur are intentional blurs, like often the pictorialists, streakless would blur to have a dreamy effect akin to painting. But what happens to photographs that are blurred not intentionally and are mere accidents and hence are often discarded? And my co-panelists have talked about selection and rejection. And this is the point when blurred photographs often get rejected from archiving. Photographs in archives and photographs are as archive often come with definitive caption or often with no caption at all. And that actually matters. And now let me run through my slides. So, well, Rahab showed this earlier. This is the metal plate. This is the first available photograph. And, okay, just going back to the previous one. In case you can't see, sure. I mean, sorry, Rahab, I have a better darkness right now, so you can see it now. So, in case you can't see the photograph, this is a later rendition. And please note that both of them have caption. I've made it a point to put caption in both the cases, and I'll talk about it. So, this is the first photograph. In case you can't see, this is a later rendition. I'll just run through this and then I'll talk again. Alright, let me pause now and just ask, does it really matter if these photographs have caption or not? You probably, I mean, many of you have seen this photograph earlier. Most of you have probably not. In that case, you'd like to know what they are. But the meaning is not coming out of the photograph. I have to insert the meaning. I have to tell you the story. So this is Alger, this is Paris, this is Edward Muybridge. This is a painted photograph by an unknown photographer, and this one late 19th century, and it's a different kind of painted photograph than the one Rahab showed you. Oh, this is from Kolkata. This is Kolkata Art Studio, a Khada visit. And this is how portraits were done in the 19th century, because the shutter speed were long. So you had to have your subject still. So what you do, you have supports. So different kinds of supports were inserted in the scene. So this is one of those. And the photographer is unknown. This one are from Talbot's book. So the Pencil of Nature. So they come from that. And I think it really matters if photographs come with caption or if they come without caption. I mean, it makes a difference in how I interpret or how you interpret. I mean, you can totally differ with my judgment, but I think it matters how I encounter photograph. So, and also the other point I want to make is, I'm talking about photographs and archives and meanings, is all these photographs were not merely about recording or merely about showing. They were also about revealing. So, and often extending the optical capacity of the human eye. So, yeah, and Rahab had pointed out earlier that it's looking out of the window. I mean, something very insignificant that you perhaps not have registered in an ideal way. And this a leaf that otherwise, in our everyday existence, we not have paid attention to. So this is showing, revealing in certain ways. Once again, I mean, remember, this is 1841. This is 1841. And people would not photograph buildings. I mean, that was not the trend. So this is also like revealing certain aspects of this architecture. Once again, very everyday scene that would not have made it to the art galleries, would have not been considered as art, and it's revealing the potentiality of the everyday to reveal itself in representation. And this is, of course, revealing the scene behind. So you have the portrait, and then you have the story behind how the subject was made to sit still. This is a child, this is a portrait. I mean, and once again, we can go on and on about the portrait. Well, what is so revealing about this? I mean, just imagine this photograph in black and white. It would have been very, very different. And what it reveals is the status of the sitter. I mean, that he's sitting on a specific kind of carpet, this specific backdrop, a chair. All that has been marked with a color here signifies something. I mean, it actually reveals the reality. The black and white photograph is not really real, right? We don't see the world in black and white, we see in color. So inserting color is not really taking the reality of the photograph. It actually is adding reality to the black and white image. And then the movement, which otherwise we not have registered, the slow motion. And of course, I mean, can you imagine a populated metropolis like Paris in a deserted way? And now I'll show you a few more, like some of my personal favorites. Walker Evans, 41. Let us now praise famous Spain. And it was a sharecropper wife. This is yet another Sunil Jana. And Rahab had shown one earlier. I mean, this is a more striking person. And this actually addresses Maharga's concern about the Anthropocene. So what is so harrowing about this image? Why are we all so shocked? Our dog is chewing on human bone. Isn't that like too bad? It is bad because it shows the decadence of the human order, right? And when we say that, we say from a very humanist perspective. But if you think from an Anthropocene perspective, it's the dog needs to feed. It's famine. The dog is also starving. It's emaciated as much as humans are. So the dog is chewing on the bone. So what's the big deal? Right? But our humanism actually like condemn how does it matter, this statement? If I say what does it matter, the humanism will condemn my statement for being inhuman, right? Cindy Sherman, revealing yet again. I mean, revealing this. Yeah, of course. I mean, Jana was the first person to break the news of famine when there was severe press censorship going on in India due to Second World War, because the British authority thought that it will adversely affect the war efforts. And Jana could do this because of some reason, and once again I can talk about that at length. And yeah, this is once again revealing the 41 crop failure in United States of America. But Cindy Sherman, like posing, like revealing the self in a different way, and that's a mirror. It's a mirror image. And finally, Andres Karski. So that's a supermarket. And I will just end here and just listen to Mahargo. And if Mahargo let me speak, I'll be happy to talk more. Thank you.
People just might have renewed interest in this. I'd like to, however, point out something very interesting that has happened through the course of this discussion. We started with a conversation on the archive and the possibility of art as archive and which streams of art then, and how do you choose an archive. What that has become in a sort of a way is also a sort of a debate on what is art, because all speakers have somehow tried to engage with, then what would be considered art. So whether you talk about a still image, which is a snapshot you've tried to recreate, or you're talking about, whether this a particular photograph is art or not, or you're talking about whether art can be archived, or whether art itself can be an archive of a certain thought process, right? So there has been the conversation has very rightfully tried to engage with the question of art itself. I would like to then bring that back to the archive then to talk about, to then pose this question to everyone, where I want to simply address the fact that what you then choose, if you're talking about the imperative of an archive that I want to collect, I want to preserve, because I want a repository of knowledge which someone might be able to access at some point of time in the future. I don't know who this new subject is who will access this archive, but I am keeping this open. So this archive will be open for a new subject who will come and access it. It's democratic. When we then talk about what is art, right, we are automatically making assumptions as to what is not art. If we are talking about using art as an archive, we are automatically letting go of those things which we chose or which we deemed as not art, which automatically did not become then part of the archive. So when we talk about a photograph which, you know, is, let's say, doesn't hold the merit of being called an art object, it's not artistic enough, if I want to stretch the argument to that level, perhaps then that blurry or not artistic enough photograph, which is a snapshot of a particular moment, how do we ascertain that that has no place in this archive? Especially now, and I again want to reassert this concern, especially now when we are already concerned with, you know, questions of what is admissible and what is not admissible, what can be said, what cannot be said, what is going to be viewed as valuable or a productive addition to knowledge and what will not be. When we are already grappling with these ideas at a larger social, cultural, political level, we must then also try and interrogate as to what we consider art, and whether or not we need to then broaden. If we find, when we look back at ourselves and we realize that we are feeling inadequate in calling certain things art, which otherwise are very, very useful to our work, but then when we are being asked whether this will form part of an art archive, and we are feeling a little unsure whether this snapshot or whether this photograph or, you know, whether this painting or this sketch has merit enough to be part of an archive, we must then automatically ask what we consider to be our definitions of art, which is an important definition to address the here and the now. That's, I think, something I don't want to ask individual questions to my speakers. They've had their long discussion already. I want to throw this as an open question to anyone who wants to intervene, and of course to all my four speakers, to talk about, you know, very little, in very small ways, to, you know, talk about these issues of censorship, these issues of what is admissible, these issues of what is considered knowledge and what is considered art, and what is consequently immediately then left out of what is knowledge and what is art. We then need to probably broaden our definitions regarding the same when we address the art and the archive now, at this moment in time, in the present, right? So with that idea, I want to open this discussion to all my speakers, and of course to anyone in the audience who wants to intervene, who wants to ask these questions. We will now, is there a mic that can be passed around? Okay, so we can share mics, and I'm sure we can pass two around if people have questions.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. Margo, I just have one objection. Sorry about that.
No, of course.
So it's basically, I would totally object with your idea that archive is democratic.
Archive is not democratic.
It depends on the
archive has a democratic impulse, right? I would again, let me correct myself. Of course, if that's what has gotten across, the archive is not democratic. The archive is made by a particular way of looking at knowledge, which is why there are so many archives, and there are always conversations, you know, that there is a gap in this archive, so there should be another archive, right? I am simply saying that the archive has a democratizing impulse, as in, technically, on paper, everyone has the right to access that archive and use that archive in, you know, in grandiose ways of writing research papers, as we all struggle with or try to write, or, you know, just simply maybe, you know, make a catalog of the everyday. Right? I want to make a catalog of the everyday. I want to make a catalog of, let's say, I want to have a catalog of, let's say, receipts of household expenses. Right? I want to make a historical study. So technically, there is a democratizing impulse.
Can I just respond?
Yeah.
Well, I have objection to that as well. I don't think archive per se, I mean, it has a democratizing impulse unless you are thinking of a specific kind of archive. Archive as an establishment, say, think of State Archive in Kolkata, which has a democratizing impulse, yet is not quite accessible to for different reasons. I mean, bureaucratic red tapes, these, that, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, if we are not thinking of archives as the spaces that houses documents, there can be memory as archive, personal memories are archive that don't have democratic impulse. I don't want to share my archive, my memory archive. And there are also personal archives that are not democratic impulse. So while talking about, I mean, as much I really like the democratic understanding of archive, of art, of photography, I mean, photography is not democratizing either. Anyway, I mean, we can go into that later, but as much as I like the idea of democracy in this context, I'm not sure, I mean, if that is, archive is democratic in impulse, unless we are thinking of archive in certain specific ways, as certain formal establishments, like state-owned, etc. So, yeah, and once again, it's an open question to you.
Probably you were talking about what is admissible within art or something like that. Yeah. To polemically answer that kind of, to answer it a bit provocatively. These days, I believe, because in classroom we actually speak of classroom of what others have said. This is a place what I believe so, and that can be put under question. I think in these days, art should be about things which are outside the boundaries of culture. Because I think here I connect with what Ronnie said a few moments ago. Victory Memorial, Howrah Bridge, everything. These are all Bengali culture. And what is actually need to be preserved is what is beyond this imagination. Until and unless art kind of steps outside culture, outside the demarcation culture, and personally I feel against culture, you don't bring in things which are outside into kind of permanence. Or in Ronnie's kind of yardsticks, the things we are seeing, we should start loving things which we are not allowed to love. Only then it can be preserved. So I think photography can play a big role here, because cinema, I think cinema is much lesser than either music or painting or even photography. Because when you photograph things which are not photographed, only then you can know that how it can be reanimated on the screen. So photograph starts with framing things which are not allowed in culture, and then it can have a place in other arts also. Just things like that.
I have a small difference with Anindo. He's saying that photography is a kind of liberating art, or it offers the scope of liberation. But there is even photography monitors, and it has a kind of tendency which might be called surveillance of memory. That is why, in fact, in the beginning, two great poets from two parts of the world, Charles Baudelaire and Rabindranath Tagore, were so much opposed to photography. Baudelaire noted a tendency towards the disappearance of history in photography. He said that it often happens that a photographer chooses a personal moment and then he or she wants to impose that on our memory. It becomes separated from the real. And the same thing about Rabindranath. He, in a letter to the poet Amiya Chakraborty, who was his secretary, said that thanks to that period, he was referring to Kalidas's period,
that there was no press photographer. Because in that case, the poet could be prevented from entering Eden, the world of imagination, the world of fantasy. He could be located in flesh and blood, and our imagination could find a limit. There you are. Photography, if it wants to enter into the domain of art, it should enter via a back door. You know, Salvador Dali, when he inserted photography inside his surreal landscapes, he wanted to overstep. And this overstepping is art. Because you know, as Rabindranath said, that when you portray a lady, Chaitanya Shama Shikari Darshana Pakkabimba Dharashti Madhyak Shama Chakita Harini Prakshana Nimna Navi, you don't see a photograph. You imagine. And this imagination is art. And when you look at a model to an actor, in Rabindranath's reference it was Mary Pickford in 1922, you are too limited. You can see the contours and the domains of our physical existence. And there, the doors are closed. So the fundamental question for photography is how to open the door and whether to close it at all. I think that's the question.
So, Mohargo, what he said about choosing and negating and stuff like that. Antoine said one thing to me in Cambodia in 2012. The great Antoine Degatha said, "I don't have a personal life." I asked him why, and then he says, whatever images I'm taking, because he works a lot, the volume of work is huge. Obviously, there is an agency which looks after his images and everything, which is fine. It's a very nice archive, and all of that is sorted. So, but what he meant was, once I'm dead, he says I don't have a personal life, because, and why I'm saying this is, say today you, me, anyone here takes an image right now, it's out and it's public, it's not private anymore. Maybe the image which has not been clicked is the private image. So like Vivian Maya, the way she was discovered, who knew about it? Who could have imagined? You know, we don't know who's doing what and what can come out after 50 years, 100 years. We don't have any control. So what happens is, and there's so much to talk about like this. Like all of us have this Joe Harris window, like 4 window. One is the open window, which I also know, you also know. There's one closed window, which I know you don't know. There's one hidden, which is you know, I don't know. And there's the last one, the dark one, none of us know. So the moment you take a picture, it goes in the open window. It's accessible. It's only time which will sort of put an end to it. It can happen whenever. So what I'm trying to say is, and what Antoine meant was that once he's dead and the images come out, it can become pornography. It can become anything. And we don't know what it can become. So what he meant was, this also has to be understood, that photography, I mean, there are certain kinds of photography which can have a certain kind of meaning once the artist or photographer is dead. But a large part of photography, something which Chandra was also trying to talk about, that every kind of photography is not art and all of that. There's a huge
chunk of work which is there in the contemporary sort of discourse that if the artist is not there, you won't know what it is. You know what I mean? Vivian Maier is great, but it's easy to understand. It's easy to appreciate. So, not all of the work that has been produced today can have any value, even if they're in any kind of archives. If it's not, as she was saying, if it's not formal, or if it's not done properly, then suddenly, say for example, a Gruski that she showed. If Gruski was not a public artist, who would say that what he was trying to do maybe 50 years down the line? How he has taken the wheel of the history of the medium forward, and he's the only artist who has done so, no one else. And what he says, say for example someone like Jeff Wall, or say, and there are some of them where what they say about the work is so important that you look at the image and you don't know. So yeah, so these are my sort of initial thoughts.
The floor had been open to the audience for some time, so if the audience, if anyone really wants to intervene and has any comments or questions that they want to ask any of the speakers, of course they're welcome to. Is there a mic? Yeah.
So my question is it's open to all of them. So you talked about photography as surveillance and how it sort of encroaches on our private lives. But do you think that photography as a form of representation is can it begin to question our received notions of what is private and what is public? Can it sort of unsettle our notions of what we consider as private and what can be represented? What are the aspects of our private life which can be open to representation? Do you think it potentially challenges this binary of private and public as an art form?
In fact, thanks for the question. This question was raised, I think, if my memory doesn't betray me, in Blow Up in 1966 by Michelangelo Antonioni. Say, just consider a situation, someone kissing someone in a park, and you photograph it. Would it constitute a violation of the private space? Has a photographer the right to intrude into a kind of intimate situation? So the whole thing gets altered. How do you define beauty? How do you define private? How do you define the public? That all, yes, I am fully deep into it that photography is a kind of social instrument which challenges and contests the boundary between the public and private. So you are forced to redefine the contours. There you are. Say, Vietnam has been bombed. Napalm has been charged. And a nude woman is rushing to a place. Life has photographed. That has become the most important photograph of the last century. What would you say? Is it pornographic image? Is it off-scene? Or is it the most tragic and horrible moment of history? The question, you can ask so many questions, but you must remain thankful to photography that it has opened the frontiers.
I think it's not only photography but any art form at large, and that's the sort of motive. And photography is the closest and to the question, I would say, because you have to see it to believe it. And good photography, or there are so many photographers, ask anyone you meet and they want to show you what you have never seen. So And as I said, there's no private life, and and there was something that was going in my mind was your there's this amazing series of people kissing in the parks in Japan, photographed with infrared cameras. It's extremely voyeuristic, and so on and so forth. Just to sort of which shows us this amazing whatever in Tokyo, what people are doing, and there are so many examples of it. Not only in photography, in cinema, in film, like Hitchcock, Rear Window. And that's what it is. We want to see, in music also, we want to know private lives. It's not the work, it's not the craft, it's not the language, or it's not what the work is. All that we get excited about is the artist. Who is he? Who is she? What is she or he trying to say? What is his or her world? The work is just a vehicle, nothing else. If the artist is interesting, exciting, we get excited. Because at the end of the day, we just want to be excited about the lives they have and the kind of stuff that they want to talk about. And that is what it is, and that's the only reason we have our heroes or whatever in our minds. That's how we choose people. That's how we sort of become very sad if somebody does a bad work who we really sort of love, and so on and so forth. So the only idea is to sort of see and know things we have never known before.
Yeah, I just want to add one more point. I mean, thank you, Chandra and Ronnie, for such wonderful explanation. I think they are a wonderful question, but I think there's need to be like one small thing that needs to be parsed, like a subtle thing. So you talked about surveillance, and then you talked about representation. So, but there are like two different things. Like if you're talking about surveillance, the image of surveillance is taking the image as real. While if you're talking about representation, it's point of view. It's Las Meninas, once again. Like going back to Sojida's point about Las Meninas. So how could you see Velasquez? There's a mirror in the painting. And the mirror is, you have to magnify the mirror in order to see Velasquez, right? So, and if you think that it's Velasquez, it's Velasquez. I mean, that's the point of surveillance, right? But if you think it's a representation, you don't have to accept that image as Velasquez. You can just accept that image as anybody's. I mean, it's just an assumption that it is Velasquez, but it may not be Velasquez at the same time, right? This is a tiny point I had. Yeah, any observer. I mean, it can be anybody. I mean, unnamed observer, or maybe me, the beholder, right? Because maybe it's me who is getting reflected in that camera. And Ronnie talked about Jeff Wall. And in one of Jeff Wall's photograph, I mean, it was just after this barmaid at counter, there's this woman, and it's what you see is actually a mirror surface. So there's a woman on the left-hand side. In the middle, there's a medium format camera. On the right is Jeff Wall himself, right? And as you see the photograph, what you actually see is the camera is facing you, right? So is it facing? So that's basically. Anyway, so the point I wanted to make about is representation and surveillance as a reality.
And sometimes surveillance and representation might actually come very because there's this film which will be shown in this festival, the famous Night and Fog. And Night and Fog actually, the entire film actually pushes you to the edge, and there the private and the public thing really matters. It's a public event, the Holocaust and concentration camps, they are public event. But there are certain moments in the film when we kind of squirm, and we think that we are into moments of privacy of the suffering people. there are moments when, and the night and fog is filled up with still photographs. And then a moment will come when you will start questioning yourself, why do this photograph exist at all? And you will end up in the harrowing question that these photographs, they do exist because the man behind the camera or the woman behind the camera, most probably men, they wanted it to. It should not have been there. But someone wanted it to be there. And therefore, so you are actually seeing a man, a concentration camp inmate, and you can see the terror in the face of the man, which actually becomes the portrait of the man who is behind the camera. Because had there been a kindlier man, had there been another inmate in the concentration camp, you wouldn't have that expression in his face. He has that expression in his face because of the man behind the camera. So their surveillance and representation kind of get blurred. And Night and Fog is a film everyone should watch actually. And the entire film is about photography, the limits of photography and so on and so forth.
I just want to talk about this crazy photographer, because we are talking about these things, Sophie Calle, who Pratik had the good fortune of meeting, where the public and the private meets and so on. So Sophie Calle was this crazy woman who didn't know, like all of us when we started photography, we were clueless about what we should do, where should we go, looking for subjects. So what she did was, she was also struggling about what she should do. So what she came up with was, she randomly picked a person and she started following him. And she said that now that thinking was being done by someone else, I was just following him. And she kept on photographing that. It went to that kind of an obsession where she followed him outside the country. Legal suits, this, that, the other followed. And her work has been like that. She's like one of the greatest conceptual photographers. Took a job as a sort of housekeeping staff in a hotel. Went to these rooms where people live, opened their cupboards, took out their bags and photographed them. So is it private, is it public, what is it, So, of course, and if you look her up, it's amazing. I just thought I should talk about, this work.
Yes, of course. Chandra sir talked about a very interesting aspect of photography. How photography can be a very lethal weapon of sorts. Like, it's a tool of history. Like the photographer he chooses was what goes down in history. So what Ronita was talking about, this stereotypical images of Kolkata, the Howrah Bridge, the Victoria Memorial, the Sindoor Khela and all of that. So can we say that we are the victim of this lethal weapon, photography? Like the same images are being repeated and they are sort of being embedded in our understanding, and those images start recurring, they continue to repeat themselves, and it inhibits us. It inhibits our imagination and prevents us from exploring other things like other images. So are we the victim of this weapon, photography?
We're victim of popular culture, it's the same. It's, what should I say? It's very cool to be a photographer, It's very cool to hang out in groups and take pictures of all these spaces. And like Sontag had said, photography is entertainment. I mean, when she's talking about photographers of this kind, she's talking about photography like entertainment and like having sex and so on. Like she would mention that the Japanese would have 2 cameras on their 2 hips and stuff like that. So it's just that and Bengalis, they love to be artists. They love to sing. You go to all these places, say Bengalis who are in New York or in London or Paris. You look at their Durga Puja and all of them want to show how talented they are and so on and so forth. Have you ever, like the way photographers go in groups to take pictures, and I see these terms like photo tours and photo walks. You would never see poets walking মানে পালের মতো তো কেউ কবিতা লিখতে যায় না এভাবে তো it's very weird, so I don't associate with it, but very objectively there is a reason this happens, and this happens because our idea of the visual vocabulary is a borrowed one. Photography has come from the West. We don't have any language as such. Whatever language we have is a hybrid one. That's number one. Number two is when people were trying to, if you look post Benushen and after that Salon and that kind of work, if you look at that, then you will see that National Geographic, Newsweek, Time, this, that, the other, Geo, all these magazines, the kind of work they were producing, where photographers from Europe and America were coming to India and taking pictures. This is what people have aspired for. Say, for example, someone like Steve McCurry, the kind of images he had done in India. There are specific tours where people go hunt down these places and try to take the same photograph, you know. So it's crazy, but this is how it is. What to do? If they like it, it's good. I mean, it's a democratic country, free country. Everybody is free to do whatever they want. But don't associate that with the art practice, please. That's what I would request. I mean, amateur photography or travel photography or contest photography and stuff like that. Don't associate that with, like, don't bring it to festivals, or don't bring it to sort of places where people are really trying hard. You know, there are photographers today in the city where they're like from the morning till the night, that's the only thing they do. So you can't expect a engineer who has a day job and goes and takes pictures at, you know, some holiday. You can't equate these two people together, you know. And these are things that we have been talking about, and let's see where it goes. And people are trying to separate these things now, you know. Yeah.
Let's not, you know, I think, yeah, of course.
Well, thank you. I have to say, the freewheeling form that your discussion has taken has sort of led me on a trail. I'm just going to go freewheeling with you a little bit to say that, you know, the burden of so many pasts are resting on all your shoulders. It's very comforting to me, because working within a space and looking at the photos of those who have perished and sort of trying to relive their lives is something that has an effect upon you. One of the effects that it has, and again addressing the girl who was talking about the private interfacing with the public, there is a court case again that was fought 4 years ago based on a photographer's work called Decorsia in New York, where he was taking photos of people in public spaces. So he asked, what is the expectation of privacy in a public space? And it took him 5 years to win the court case to say that there is none, that there is no expectation. And I think maybe what should also be recognized is that if you are talking about images, you are talking about a surfeit of images. I mean, I would like to know if many people know that between Facebook and Instagram, they are actually fighting 4 court cases for many years, because everything that everyone here has uploaded is open for usage by them without taking permission from any of you as the authors of that work. I'd also like to think a little bit about the difference between, as you intimated, the collection and the archive. What is the difference between a collection and what is differentiating an archive from that? Because it comes to questions of connoisseurship. Now, connoisseurship is a notion based on which the history of art has virtually been written. But that connoisseurship has changed because everyone has become an author in some respect or the other. A lot of what institutions used to do is acquire material, but they were also consistently de-accessioning material with the passage of time. So that is, hello? Yeah, so that is interesting to say, if you have a collection of acquisition, you also have to have the archive as an endlessly receding shoreline, where things constantly fall over, but the surfeit goes on and on. So what you privilege is what you're asking about, and I'm not so sure whether it's easy to intimate that, because there is already a museum of exiled objects. It's in Tibet. There is already a museum of nothing. It's in Houston. And the idea of the Museum of Nothing was simple, is that you go and fill it with whatever ideas you have. In fact, because we don't have museums, as Ronnie is suggesting, that do not live up to public expectations, maybe we should, as an exercise, do an exhibition of what that expectation can be and keep that as an installation, as a permanent installation somewhere. Maybe it's a possibility in this Museum of Nothing. I also want to think a little bit about something that you're intimating, which is a kind of rhizometric sensibility about data management. And maybe in this, what is significant to remember is there's raw data that is produced as part of what accounts for an archive. There's metadataing that is produced. And I'm not so sure, taking Ronnie's point again, whether the amateur photographer brought to a festival should not show his work, because the kind of material that exists today is also working in proportions. The 19th century, if you look at it as a mass of an archive of material that was produced, images that are produced today in one day are more than the entire 19th century. How do you actually relate those two? And I think that is somewhere something to be thought about. But maybe the archive then is more of a social sculpture. Maybe then, because Ronnie has a very young and strong body, with six-packs, maybe it is not the body that you are in right now, which is a young body, but maybe you can think of yourself as an ancient body in which you are currently residing. Will that give us a sensibility about what our role in time is going to be? That ephemerality and transitoriness, in which things will always get privileged without us knowing or wanting them to. But it is not that you shouldn't volunteer that as critique or as insight. But the citizenry of the world works very differently. So the invitation or the invocation should always be to have material volunteered. And I would give you agency also to say that if these iconic buildings and spaces are problematic, they are also problematic because one has allowed them to be. And so the agency must rest with what we volunteer as alternatives to them. And no, so for me, one of the things I wanted to maybe end with is that one of the people we haven't mentioned, because we've mentioned all the European references and so on, was someone who did this in the early 20th century, and his name was Anand Kumar Swamy. When he joined the Boston Museum, he actually created the photographic department there. So I would not think that the idea of collections or managements and so on is always working from Europe to India, that we are always creating that hybrid. I think the sensibility to an image practice, forget about photography, expands the notion of what actually the consequences for the visible and visuality is. So I want to thank you actually for instigating these things, because I wouldn't have thought of them if they didn't come up in this way.
I think we can take this discussion somewhere else, because I think that's the point where we end. Right, I think that explanation wraps this entire, or what was the focus of this discussion. I think we can always, this discussion never ends, right? So we can always take it off this podium and maybe into more personal spaces. Because I think people are also going a little crazy with the time that we have overshot. So no, but we can of course continue, right? No, so there are like actual physical.
It's about point of view. We'll just imagine it's hot. It's all right.
If may I, can I add just one thing?
Yeah, of course, please. Yes.
Sorry, I'm not going to take much time. Something that Ronnie mentioned, and I have always felt to talk about this. I just want to give a recent example, which last year when the Nobel Prize was decided to give it to Bob Dylan for literature, and why I find it very important is there's a lot of controversy because a lot of people say, okay, he's a musician, and why you're giving it to him? Well, there's a lot of writer is there and working really hard. A lot of people say Bob Dylan is already too big for a Nobel. He doesn't need a Nobel, right? You can, decide whichever side you want to. But one of the most interesting thing that did was, in the history, was that how the medium was shifted and broadened. So it's not just with pen and paper you can write literature now. You can also write literature with music. And I think photography always has this burden of becoming too many things. It has to represent truth. It has to be an archive. It has to become, okay, it's art. I think there's a lot of those things around there. But I think after 20 years or 30 years maybe, or hopefully earlier than that, we'll have a different sort of discussion. We'll talk about novel. We'll talk about literature. We'll talk about poetry with this medium. And that's the evolution. As like film is happening, I think the extension of literature and poetry, and these are nowadays, is what we are doing with films and photography. So I think we also need to think, we can think a little bit beyond this archiving with photography and also representing truth, and is photography is art or not, because I think now it's the time to go in different zone.
Just 1 second, Maharjo. So this was Sarkar Pratik, one of the finest photographers from this part of the world. He lives in Dhaka. JOPC has been very fortunate to have him here. Just responding to Rahab, as in no enmity with amateur photographers at all. I love them. And I truly believe that the history, the medium can only move forward with the amateurs. But that's a different discussion. The thing that I was trying to say was very specific to a kind of photography that has been blown out of proportion in this part of the world and somewhere else as well. But yes, I mean, so many photographers were amateurs, all these William Klein maybe, Walker Evans, and so many here in this country as well. So not at all. I mean, I truly believe that it's the amateurs who take it ahead, always. That's how the snapshot came. That's how so many other things came. Thank you.
Yeah, just a small point. I won't take more than 2 minutes. Thanks, Rahab, for bringing the question of Kumaraswamy. Yeah, and Ronnie, I would beg to differ that it's a Western form that came to the Eastern part. So I would rather talk about a shared vocabulary of photography, and they developed simultaneously. And if you remember, I mean, 39, when it was patented, London, Paris, it was within 6 months that photography was in Calcutta and in Bombay. And they were developing simultaneously in both sides of the story. So, and it continued like that. So I would not say that it's a Western form that came here and we don't really have any, but I would just think of somebody like Upendra Kishore Rai Chaudhuri. I mean, he was contributing as much as he was receiving in that way, and he was in constant dialogue with practitioners in London, and he was publishing there, and there was a thing going on, and he's not an exception. And Shukumar Rai after that, exactly, and more interestingly, in the British Journal of Photography, interestingly, the acronym is BJP. Shukumar Rai's obituary, the 50% of Shukumar Rai's obituary was about Upendra Kishore's achievement. And so, yeah, there was a dialogue, and the stuff actually developed simultaneously and in conversation. So it's not quite grafting something from elsewhere. Or maybe the history has yet to be written. But yeah, as a historian, I'll take the baton.
Okay, so I think we can safely call an end to this discussion. We have spoken at length. We have spoken without rest. So I think people who are on the edges of their seat and waiting to get up should. because we have not allowed them to. So on that note, good evening. Thank you for... Who is Arjun? There's another little point that is left, so we will pass it. Simply pass it.
We need to felicitate the panel members, so please don't ask them to leave. We thank the speakers for such a brilliant and enlightening panel discussion and for joining us today. Just a gentle reminder, everyone, a part of the installation will take place in Jadavpur University. We shall also have a small inauguration program followed by a talk by Berlin-based photo media artist Boris Eldarson. We look forward to seeing you there. Have a very good evening. Thank you.